Let's roll.
Good evening. I'm Lori Salganikoff with the Chestnut Hill Conservancy. We're an educational center and advocate for the architecture, open space, and history of Chestnut Hill and surrounding communities in the Wissahickon watershed. We're proud to present tonight's lecture by the iconic Carol Franklin as part of our work to protect and celebrate the area's natural and built environment, our tradition of innovative community planning, and neighborly concerns for each other and our surroundings. Another icon in our landscape, Rob Fleming, will present a virtual lecture on January 21st entitled Accidental Master Plan, the Fortuitous Open Spaces of Chestnut Hill. Tickets are available now. Also mark your calendars for our January 10th annual meeting with our preservation awards and a membership vote on our 2021 board. I hope you are all members, but if not, membership starts at $50 and you can sign up on our website. Tonight's lecture and much of our work this past year has been made possible in no small part by the support of our lead sponsor, BMT. Kim Trubiano, president of BMT's insurance division, would like to welcome you. And then our program committee co-chair, Jean McCoubry, will introduce Carol Franklin. Kim?
Thank you, Lori, and good evening, everyone. As Lori shared, my name is Kim Trubiano, and I am the president of Bryn Mawr Trust Insurance Advisors. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, we are located on Highland Avenue in the very heart of Chestnut Hill. Many of you may know us from the former Hirshhorn Boothby agency, and I have the very distinct privilege of working with Chestnut Hill's very own Dick Boothby every day. Bryn Mawr Trust, parent company of BMT Insurance Advisors, is extremely pleased to be lead sponsor and partner with the Chestnut Hill Conservancy for 2020. Bryn Mawr Trust, being over 130-year-old financial services company, offering banking and insurance, is proud of our history of service to our clients and communities. This historical pride aligns with the Conservancy and their goals to protect the history of architecture, land preservation, and investing in and for our communities. I'm personally very excited and grateful to be here this evening to welcome you, and I invite you to learn more about us by visiting bmt.com. So without further ado, I'll turn this back over for us to begin the evening's lecture with Carol Franklin. Thank you, Lori.
Thanks, Kim. Jean?
Hi, I'm Jean McCoubry, and Susan Peck and I co-chair the Conservancy's program committee. So we're in charge of figuring out how to get great speakers and convince them that they can actually do it on Zoom this year and so on. Speaking of Zoom, if all of you participants could please mute yourselves and turn off your video for the duration of the lecture. And also I will be monitoring the chat function, which is should be at the bottom of your screen. If you want to ask questions in that chat box, then we'll have time for some Q&A at the end of the presentation. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Carol. We're so happy that you accepted our invitation and could and agreed to cope with this virtual format. Carol is a lifelong member of our Chestnut Hill Mount Airy quadrant of the city. She's a landscape architect with nationally and internationally recognized expertise in sustainable landscape design. She's a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects and has received many honors for her professional work. She and her husband, Colin Franklin, are co-founders of the firm Andropogon Associates, landscape design firm, also known for its expertise in sustainable design. She's also a beloved teacher and mentor, having taught for several decades at Penn in the Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning School and in their historic preservation program, and has mentored many young aspiring landscape architects and preservationists. Some of you may have read Metropolitan Paradise, which is a fantastic 4-volume series about our own Wissahickon Valley, its history and ecology, which Carol co-wrote with local historian David Contasta. There are many more things I could add, but I think from her talk, you'll begin to appreciate what a font of knowledge she is about our environment, its history, and why it's such a unique and beautiful place. Carol?
Yes. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining this wonderful piece of modern technology. Today, we're going to talk about what are the patterns, what structures a community, and what makes our community, which is really extraordinary, especially as we wander around all the others in the United States, so special and so rich a pattern. So we're going to look first at the idea, the biggest idea, which is that this community, rather uniquely, although there are of course others and indigenous communities do it often, that really reach out and include nature in the built environment so that they're blended together. And much more than that, as we're going to see in this lecture, how the natural drainage pattern has structured Mount Airy and Chestnut Hill. And I'm sort of going to lump those two together because they're very, very similar. This picture, which is by Rolf Sauer, my former partner, does show this wonderful thing on Gate Lane where the building is reaching out into the sidewalk, where little holes are cut so that the trees can break through, and where the whole context, the rug on which the community is organized, that's not going to work, is organized, is basically the natural drainage pattern. Here again, at the smallest scale, this idea that nature can break through into the very giving built pattern. And this, of course, is the beach and the Kitchens Lane gutter in West Mount Airy. Oh, press this. Okay, excuse me, everybody. And here, again, a taste at the middle scale. These are just big overview pictures to remind you of what was so very special about our community. It's a forested community. And there are very, very few others in the United States, and in fact, in the world. And there's a tendency in too many communities to take the forest down as you begin to build your community. And here you see the forest surrounding and the driveway becoming that penetration into the little opening glade that is the kind of open space you get in a forest. Just to give us a big overview and to remind us of where we are and what it is. This first map shows Wissahickon Park within the Wissahickon watershed and within the city of Philadelphia. As you can see, it's a major, major part of northwestern Philadelphia. And as we will explore later on, Roxborough, which in many ways has more open space and more park than Chestnut Hill and Mount Airy, did not take advantage of it, and it wasn't their fault. It was the time of development. The second map shows the three watersheds, the upper, middle, and lower valley that the Wissahickon watershed is divided into. I'm going to go on and remind you that this is our wonderful Wissahickon with its incredible gorge, and how for a very long time, nearly 2 centuries, people have been enjoying it in all sorts of imaginative ways and building their houses above it, but not within the floodplain and not on the steep slopes that border the floodplain. This is just a quick pastiche to remind you all of the many, 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 many things that can be done, and the many, many different kinds of people who come to enjoy the Wissahickon Park. It is really the core, the heart, the living, beating heart of our community, and it's what helps to make it so special, and it's what structures our community. The Middle Valley, this is just to remind you, and those of you who are old enough to remember, just after World War II, this used to be farmland and still preserved in the institutions like the Morris Arboretum and Erdenheim Farm and Carson Valley School. We still get that sense of farmland, but the relentless drive, and you can see it here in the bottom of the picture, to suburbanize is always upon us, and it has very much changed some of the character and encroached in some very difficult and problematic ways on the Wissahickon and its tributaries. Just to remind you of the sad top of the watershed, much of it is of the headwaters of the Wissahickon is under Montgomery Mall and its parking. And if you look at the drainage areas, you just stand here and look down, you can see the Wissahickon rushing underneath you. This picture at the top here is just a reminder that not so very long ago, this place was entirely rural and could have been developed with a great deal more sensitivity. Not that I don't shop at all these places, so I suppose I'm not the one to speak. Now, what I want to explore with you is just very quickly the 5 communities that surround Wissahickon Park as you're coming out of Center City. One of the extraordinary things about Wissahickon Park is that it connects to the larger Schuylkill Park. And also the second part of that is that it is probably Philadelphia's most intact riverine park. That is thanks to the Woodwards and other people, the Houstons, who bought and donated much of the tributaries, and thanks to the very forward-looking park system at the time the park was being created, much of the floodplain and the working tributaries, the viable tributaries have been preserved. Unfortunately, William Penn, when he came, had the idea that you would develop according to plan, which was the Germantown, which was flat and easy to develop, and with obvious place to put railroads and big industries, would develop first. And Chestnut Hill would develop much along the way. It turned out in the end that it was Roxborough that was developed last, and we will see what that meant. The natural drainage structure pattern structures the community, allowing the forest to interfinger with most of the houses. This is probably the most important message that I can give you tonight about this community. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you can see these fingers coming out into the community, Gresham Creek, many of the others, up Rex Avenue and all these places, Bells Mill Road, of course. Here, you're allowed to have all the houses that have developed in there are facing basically a pathway to the park. And this allows everybody to participate, or so many more people than would otherwise participate if you just had a narrow band lining the main creek. This, by the way, is a bird mask, which was performed in Carpenter Woods by the students from Henry School, and they're all dressed up as birds. And this was done for years before World War II and just after. And now, of course, it's been abandoned. Thankfully, they're working very hard to reclaim Carpenter Woods, but for years it was just abandoned and grew over. It used to have big meadows in the middle. And those big meadows were the places that this bird mask was performed. But it really drew the schools into our community and the school children into appreciation of the birds there. Carpenter's Woods was a bird sanctuary. It still is, but it's not something that we really remember or celebrate as much anymore. This I bet is a surprise for you. Philadelphia's post-war rush to build out vacant land. It turned out that after World War II and after the GI Bill, which allowed young soldiers to get married and come home and want to move into a new house of their own, they were all moving out to the suburbs, taking their money with them. And the city of Philadelphia became extremely anxious that we not have this drain out to the suburbs of people of means or people of moderate means. And so they looked around for places in the city which had large lumps of open space. And rural Roxborough was the place they fixated on. Many of you know that they even toyed at the time with bringing the UN to an area near the Schuylkill Valley Nature Center. But essentially a rural landscape was transformed after World War II into a suburban landscape. In some cases quite charming, with little houses in Andorra. In some places absolutely horrible, with the worst of the 1950s ranch houses. And here you see Eero Saarinen's plan for Roxborough. The Planning Commission did a lot of fancy planning for this. Much of it came to nothing, but they did build the mall and the shopping center. And they had planned a terrifying bridge out here to cross over Bell's Mill, cross over before Bell's Mill at Cathedral Road, which fortunately was stopped. This is the issue with Roxborough because it was created basically out of farmland at a time when Americans were falling madly in love with their automobiles. You had an impetus to build a huge parkway in Henry Avenue to link the top of Roxborough to the bottom and then into Center City. The problem with Henry Avenue is that even though there's more parkland on this side and it's flat and very usable, because of the arterial itself and the cars rushing by, and also because of this phalanx of houses, which are basically row houses, one on top of another, there's really no ways to begin to filter through down. So you have a wall against the park, this being the park, and the houses themselves making a wall just at Henry Avenue and cutting most of Roxborough off from the neighborhood. And that brings us to one of the major principles in structuring this city, one which sadly was not realized in Roxborough. If you look over here on the left side, you'll see an aerial photograph of Chestnut Hill. One of the things that Chestnut Hill did, and nowadays we may fault that for some reasons, was to put the richest people against the park. This meant that the largest mansions, and you can see them here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there you can see the large houses are at the edge of the park. And this allows the park to filter up with all its vegetation and basically the houses to be engulfed in the park. And one of the things that happens in our neighborhood and in Mount Airy is that you get successive waves of building with successive waves of density. The colonial spine, which is Germantown Avenue, was very dense. And then came the Victorian era, which was minimally dense, sort of dense. And then a 1920s, basically these are the country houses, which devolved into the country mansions at the base, just at the edge of the park. And this allows the whole park to finger up, not only through the fingers of the tributaries, but also just to come up through. And many of you know that streets like Chestnut Hill Avenue, you can just park your car and walk down into the park on one side of the houses, etc. So there are lots and lots of places that have been left in the community to penetrate the common resource and to use it and enjoy it. When housing was built in Roxborough, unfortunately, a different mentality prevailed. And you can see here this line against the park. and these wonderful suburban lawns with their little balls and bumps of plants. No attempt at all to bring the forest into the community and the community into the forest. And here are two maps which also further explain this gradient of density. You can see here the darkest color, that's Germantown Avenue and the shopping center and the row houses. And then you get the sort of middle-sized lots with largely Victorian houses sitting in about a half acre of land. And then as you come down here, you get the country mansions, the country houses of the 1920s that were featured in House and Garden, etc., and became a style that swept most of the Northeast. One of the sad things you see, of course, things like Cherokee, and I don't fault Cherokee for this, but the community allowed a lot of very intense development then to start coming to the edge of the park, or semi-intense development. And that began to break this pattern, this gradient, where it should get more and more wild, less and less intense development as you come toward the wilderness, so that the wilderness can filter back up. One thing we have done very well is the open space. We have put large areas of private and semi-private open space adjacent to the park, which visually and intellectually and emotionally includes the park in their open space and makes it seem much bigger. The Morris Arboretum, the schools, Chestnut Hill Academy, which is now has another name, it's a maiden name, et cetera, et cetera. And so another principle that makes this neighborhood seem much bigger than it is and much greener than it actually is the principle of the borrowed landscape. And what I'm going to do now is to go through a number of these principles, which were actually created serendipitously, as Rob Fleming's lecture is going to talk about the open space. And these principles of development were also serendipitous. They sort of happened and people followed them. They liked them and they followed them. But you see here the walls, and this is a quarter acre house, a house of a quarter acre lot, a tiny house with a tiny garage next to a great big mansion. But because of this, using the same materials, basically Wissahickon schist, the natural geology of our area, and allowing the forest to seep on up through the gardens and through the properties, what we have is a sense that it's all one neighborhood, it's all one piece of property. And we can appreciate much more of our landscape than we would if we were a series of suburban houses with fences around it. Drainage is another thing that has been handled very imaginatively in this community. And before I get into how we've done it, just want to go over with you a little bit about what kinds of problems bad drainage leads you to. You're all familiar with large apartment buildings with enormous parking lots, enormous roofs, and all this, and a lot of lawn, which has a 95% runoff if it's well cared for. So all of this landscape basically runs into the gutters in the parking lot and the gutters in the road. And it comes down in a great untrammeled rush into the Wissahickon, which is, of course, these are done on the slopes, on the plateau, and this is the slopes, and this is the valley. So you're having the water rush down the slopes and land in the valley, doing an enormous amount of damage. The sedimentation and erosion, the cutting into the banks and the toppling of the trees, the armoring of many of the channels which the water flows down only intensifies and concentrates that rush of water. One of the things that Chestnut Hill, and to a certain extent, somewhat in Mount Airy, you see are the little tiny tributaries, the capillaries of the drainage network. The tiny headwater streams have been allowed to exist even on fairly modern properties. This is one property on Norwood Avenue where you can see the stream. Norwood is a wonderful place to go and look at this because there's several different streams that have been preserved. And at the back of Norwood, there's one great big, slightly larger capillary, tiny stream that's been preserved by a series of landowners there. This just, the more light, the more air, the more natural the water system is, the less erosion, the healthier the water, the better it is treated. Even if sewage and things like that run into it, it has a chance to repair itself. The other wonderful thing, and many of these are disappearing thanks to Philadelphia Streets Department. I always go out there and say, please, please save the gutters, but they don't. And I realize that that's not the way to do it. These wonderful gutters, which became part of the community and organized the street so that you never had a street that was too much asphalt. You have these wonderful materials on the side. And if you can see, the water is actually running down here. I used to drink out of this. It shows you that the water quality was fairly good. And as it says in the text, the plants, the bugs, the bacteria, which all work to improve the water, the runoff that's carried into Wissahickon Creek as part of why the system is healthy and why it works so functionally well. Unfortunately, it's something we're losing in the great push to make the streets more efficient. This is a lovely, this is, whoops, I'm sorry. How do I go back? Oop, no. Yes. I'm sorry about that. The restored gutter at Norwood Avenue is this. I don't know if you can see and if it's still there, the title to this one, which is a brand new gutter that was made only 10 years ago or so by Neil Korostoff to take the water from the hillside. You can see this is a hillside driveway, which would have water pouring off it. This is the farm at the bottom of that development in the fields. I can't remember its name. But you see here, it traps the water as it comes down, like a French drain, except it isn't, carries the water off, and gradually dissipates it into the green landscape. And here at Richard Snowden's old house is this wonderful bog garden. Again, taking advantage of the forest and taking advantage of the wet forest to create a boggy garden instead of obliterating it and making it a part of the celebration and setting of the house. Another thing that is terribly important in our community is the way the railroads were put in. There is no wrong side of the track in Chestnut Hill, Mount Airy. The railroad either goes under the community, as in this first picture at Wissahickon Heights Station, that's St. Martin's, and as you can see, the trestle railroad bridge across Gresham Creek. And the thing is, the community just flows right through, and there's no sense that there's one side of the track and another side of the track. The poor people live on one side, the rich people live on the other. And so the whole matrix of the community flows. It flows up from the park. The railroads and the roads don't work to cut it off or stop it. They enable it by the way they're planned and by the way they're built. This is a little exploration of the roads. I suppose you might say meander instead of streets woozle through the community, but I think you know what I mean. They do woozle, and how wonderful it is that they woozle. Streets that go straight through, like Henry Avenue, tend to make very fast traffic and really destroy the ambiance of the neighborhood. It's something that modern planners have just come to learn again. But all this woozling has allowed many different things. The curving and swerving has allowed the woods, the Wissahickon woods beyond here, to become part of the street, and has also slowed the traffic and generally created a more village atmosphere. The other thing about the streets is that they were basically planted and designed as cathedral nave and side aisles. In other words, the nave is here with the altar at the back there, and the light falls on one of the residential properties. And what you see are these wonderful overarching street trees, planted in this case only 4 to 6 feet apart, and a double row. So that as you walk down the sidewalk, you have a double row of trees. They're European lindens, but what the heck. And here you see the plan, and you can see it's a double row. And there is the street, and there is the sidewalk. And on more ordinary streets, you also get this wonderful sense of cathedral nave and side aisles, Springfield Avenue, of course. And there in the fall, again, this is something we have to really push for in our community, because if we begin to lose the street trees and people stop planting them because they're a nuisance or something, we will lose this sense of forested community, even in the most developed and most built up areas. And here are the sidewalks, and very often you have a double row of trees as you do here on Elbow Lane. And in this case, on Moreland Avenue, you have the trees coming up and the shrubs from the neighboring property, from the adjacent property, and then the row of street trees, making this wonderful sense of a forested roadway and a forested neighborhood. And then this is Morning. Morning becomes McCallum Street. This is that loss of these wonderful bands which structured and ordered the landscape adjacent to the road. Nobody really wants a mass of asphalt. And what has happened is we lose the gutters, we lose the planting strip, we lose the sidewalks, we're losing all that, and the roads are gradually encroaching and getting larger and larger. So we're having a solid phalanx of asphalt up against our residential properties. So there's no public property anymore. There's no public space. And that's a sad loss and something we should fight. Another loss, one of the things George McNeely and I were talking about is our remembrances of the rural landscape, which was so very much part of our forested landscape. It sort of snuck down from the White Marsh Valley, which was wonderfully fertile, limestone valley, gently rolling, not like our acid Wissahickon soils with our steep slopes and rocky outcrops. But there were always little edges of rural bits that still gave the community a less formal, less suburban character. And here you see all these new suburban houses built around the golf course, and they had left originally this wonderful hedgerow. And that gives it all the character and changes the whole nature of this street. And if you go there now, you will see the gradual move towards suburbanization and its principles. Another wonderful aspect of this community, and again, something those new urbanistic planners are trying to cotton onto as fast as they can, is alleyways. We have such a breadth of different kinds of alleyways, which create these back pathways and play areas, which are safe, very few cars, and somewhat surveyed by the adjacent houses, and very green, with the greenery from both the alleyway itself and the greenery from the adjacent yards, making part of the forested community. And parking, we have several different kinds of parking. The communal parking we have, which is wonderfully, very few communities really offer this, and this is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And it's very rural in character and very informal. This is off, was it Highland Avenue? Highland Station? And this, again, quite near there, off St. Martin's. Yes, this is off St. Martin's. But these wonderful little parking places, courts, but very informal, almost rural in character. Again, they become play areas, and they extend the small backyards of some of these tighter houses. And one of the great things, which is not explored in this lecture, is the multiplicity of housing types that are offered. But some of the quads, etc., these multiple housing, the triplicates, etc., duplexes, courts, all of these things benefit from these courts and from these extra green spaces in the community, spaces to do things in, spaces to walk through, and spaces to park your car in. On an individual house level, on the left, that's Sulgrave Manor, you have something that you see in many, many of the stone houses of this neighborhood, which is the walls come out and make an enclosing place to put the car. So the car is never, thrust onto the street or thrust into your nose as you're coming to the house with it, and it's generally enfolded into the house and becomes a part of the house. And this happens at a communal scale too, in the very broad number of courts that are provided, which have multiple houses, in this case, multiple garages and a big parking court, and then the street. This is the entrance to the green court, which is the entrance to the houses, which are back here. And then on this side, the street itself. So the house, again, the cars are sheltered from the street is sheltered from the cars, and can become a cathedral with nave and side aisles. Driveways, too, are treated very differently here. Even when you have multiple driveways, there's always greenery between them, and always a sense that they're tucked right into the structure of the landscape. And here, a much longer driveway with this wonderful business of pink dogwoods and white dogwoods, making an incredibly arched tunnel to go under, and unbelievably floriferous in the spring. And the longer driveways, which are the ones generally closest to the park with the larger houses, go down through a wooded opening and usually arrive at an entrance court. And here you see it in a very large house, and here in a medium-sized house on Wesley Street. Again, the fronts are forested too. This is the old Willing house, which became Ernesto Ballard's house and now someone else's house. But almost all the principles that we are looking at are encapsulated in this house. It's a very short driveway going to a very small garage, but it becomes just part of this wonderful forested landscape where the actual Wissahickon woods wraps around and becomes part of the house itself. The other thing, of course, and we'll look at that later, is the moss rather than grass. Some forecourts are very truncated and very small. This is the old Willett stained glass studio on Springfield, I think. And here you see it's just an arched gateway, a wall, and then about 12 feet of space. But again, it's an invitation into a series of entry experiences which begin to create a journey to the house and make everything special. When you just fall into the house, it's not very special. And this is a wonderful one on Scotford's Road, our roofer's house, where you step down these marvelous steps into a very small entrance court, and you see the house nestled in the woods. And actually on Scotford's Road, the Wissahickon Woods is behind these houses. And then, of course, the very large formal entry courts which are very grand and very special. Again, the L-shaped house, the house which begins to embrace, the walls which begin to embrace, everything is making space. It's not sitting in space, it's creating space. And the hill itself is brought in. The hill is over here. There's the retaining wall, and then beyond it, the hill itself not only brings the forest in because it's a forested hillside, but it creates a side to this court and makes a very formal and beautiful entry. In the headmaster's house on Springfield Avenue, you have this long driveway which takes you to a series of courts. The first court is the entry court and the door over here, and the second court is a service court. This is true on Westview Street too. Often have these houses which have a first court and then a second court behind, which receives all of the working elements of the house. This is another drawing by Rolf Sauer, and this is possibly the most astounding half room in all of Chestnut Hill. I think the idea of half rooms is one of the most popular ideas about the Wissahickon style. It certainly is a feature that has made it houses in the forest. Again, the wall reaches out, the wall is pierced. This is the Wissahickon Woods beyond and High Hollow beyond that. And you see this multiple stemmed oak is hopped over and is allowed to be in the courtyard. And then you have your formal grass for croquet or sitting around or having a party or whatever. But then gradually, this house too has its own gradient of wildness as you go from the formal lawns, the house is embracing that, and then gradually you slither out and become part of the Wissahickon Woods. I didn't show you that. Here's the actual steps beyond the lawn in the Willing Ballard house. And you can see that the gradient of wildness is even present in such a detail as this steps. This takes you up to a further court that's above the garage. And the Wissahickon Woods is here beyond, and you can see the forested edge. And here a little line of local shrubs. And beyond that, you have the grass court and the formal landscape. This is Drum Moor, and again, the woods down here beyond, and a very formal presentation, but still the pathways through the woods. And this is my own property when it was looking slightly better. And you see that the spaces that you have in a forested landscape are these tiny little glades where the sun comes down as a beam of light, little tiny pathways winding through the garden to bring you to these tiny open spaces. And this is again in my yard. This is our hot tub. And there are many more delectable details in this neighborhood, but I happen to have this on hand for this lecture. And you can see that everything that you can imagine, whether it's a hot tub or a shed or a formal lawn to play on, all of these things take their own characteristic vocabulary and presentation from the idea of being in a forest. You can see the forest surrounding this whole thing. And again, this is just a glade that is opened in the forest with subtle little steps and using of natural rock, which is all through this neighborhood, the Wissahickon schist and the bluestone from the upper part of the state, and then gradually winding in to these tiny little spaces. You still get an enormous variety of spaces, but it's not all given to you as an open lawn with a swing set in it. And here again, just a little glade. This is, we're moving into talking about lawns. Lawns are treated very differently in this situation. Again, the suburban lawn is all around the house. It's the rug that the house sits on. In this case, the rug that the house sits on is the forest. And the openings in the forest are the grassy areas where the sun shines and the grass can grow. And they become little sitting areas and little destinations and little ends of journeys. This is my yard too. I'm sorry about this. But, and this is Ernesta Ballard's house again, and this is the moss. One of the other alternatives that you can have are alternative lawns. Lawn grass, as we know, is a European import. It's very expensive to maintain. It puts a lot of pesticides and herbicides into the Wissahickon. Moss, on the other hand, as it says here, is a native plant. And unfortunately, you will find if you're trying to maintain a lawn that you have terrible patches of moss because it loves the acidic soil and you dig around to get rid of it. Well, Ernesta Ballard didn't do that. She did the opposite. She weeded out all the grass and all the other things and just had this wonderful Japanesey moss lawn, which will take over. And lastly, the shadow lawn, which is the great Victorian lawn, of course. It is only a forest which has had the understory taken out of it. And so you see the great lawn underneath the tall trees who cast their long trunk-like shadows across this lawn. But it's a shadowed lawn, it's a shady lawn. And most of the colleges of the United States have their campuses organized on this principle. Now, to finish up, I'd just like to talk for a moment, relatively compactly, because it's a long and difficult problem, about the threats to our community. If we accept the fact that it is a forest community, then we have to come to grips with the fact that this forest is rapidly deteriorating because of the many assaults that we are allowing to happen to it. This is vines, invasive exotics, dying trees, and actually this is on the path to the Wissahickon. It's not a good thing to look at. And this is what a healthy forest looks like. The rich understory, and lots and lots of trees and lots of ages of trees. One of the things you see here is that a healthy forest, if you look on the ground, has a lot of leaf litter, and you pull the leaf litter up and you see this white stuff is not snow, it's fungus, fungus among us. And it's the fungus that makes the forest healthy. If you see this, you have a healthy forest. The fishermen bring the worms, but we also bring the worms in our compost piles and all of those other things. Worms create bacteria, and bacteria makes meadows and grasslands. Fungi make forests. So what we are looking for as we go into the Wissahickon wood is essentially fungus. Fungus on the ground, running mycelium all over everywhere. This is the leaf scraped back. So this would be all under this thing, not the bare soil with the worm churned, bacteria ridden. And that's not bad. They're not bad bacteria. It's just that it is, and it is not what the forest feeds on. The forest uses fungus in its ecosystem. Another terrible threat, of course, is stormwater mismanagement. This is a house in Roxborough. You'll think I'm jumping on Roxborough. I'm not, but because it was developed latest, all of our late post-war faults are visible in Roxborough. And there wasn't as much room in Chestnut Hill for this kind of egregious development. And so you see that it just comes right off the roof, down the rain spouts, right down the driveway, down the sloped road, and into the Wissahickon, where it does things like this. It just gouges out the banks of the stream, and anywhere that the water hits, it will start to take the soil away. And here you see just a diagram to explain that forest cover will allow the groundwater to seep into the soil and end up in the stream. If you pave over that same block of soil with roofs and buildings and parking lots and paths and roads, all of that water will run off. It doesn't penetrate the soil. It doesn't feed the vegetation. It doesn't recharge the stream. And so in summer, the Wissahickon Creek is all recycled sewage, not fresh water coming down from the rains and seeping through the soil and gradually refilling the stream at times when it's not raining. The last threat is really uncontrolled development. This is the site of the D'Souza Brown proposed development. They propose not only to overlap the creek, but also to build extremely densely right up against the creek. And already we have a creek that is very neglected and needs really for the citizens to adopt it and to begin to think of it as a vibrant waterway and a wonderful corridor of green that runs through East Chestnut Hill and East Mount Airy. This was a proposal, and we all hope it will go through, for the Gresham Valley Trail adjacent to the Gresham Creek, above its banks on the old railway line, the old Reading Railroad. And there you see the forest on the other side. And we hope that someday this can come to pass. It's been talked about for 20 to 30 years and little happens, which is a shame. The other sad aspect of this is the way we treat our headwaters. This is the headwater of the Gresham Creek. A little is collected from a few factories up here and dumped onto this public park, which is the only green part of the headwaters. And it's completely sterile. It's grass and very poor grass at that. And so there's no chance for the bugs, the plants, etc., to create healthy water flow, a healthy water and flowing water. So as you can see, despite the fact that it's the headwaters, it should be a little trickle of wet here, which will go to make the Gresham Creek. It's just bare, and you can see that through all the tributaries as you go up Bethlehem Pike. They're bare, they're empty, they have no water in them. Thanks to Laurie Salganikoff and others of the Chestnut Hill Conservancy. This is the easement program, and here we move into positive territory, all the extraordinary things that are being done in our community to try to preserve it. This is the lower Wissahickon, of which we are a part. This is the middle valley. The red shows priority parcels. Over 100 acres have been preserved, as you can see. One of the reasons the Chestnut Hill Conservancy changed its name from the Chestnut Hill Historical Society is really to include this idea that Chestnut Hill is not just buildings, it's buildings and landscape in an extraordinary matrix, which allows that natural world to come up and to begin to give it its character. Again, another very positive thing was the recycling of these huge estates, which seem to be such white elephants. Gresham, Drummore, a number of the others, Anglecott. A number of people have really seized the initiative on this and made absolutely extraordinary public and private spaces and added new developments. As you can see here, the new houses, which fit in remarkably well and in a pattern that's very conducive to the spirit of our neighborhood. The conservation of heritage open space. Probably the most splendid example of that was the 2-decade struggle to save Erdenheim Farms as the Dixons felt they had to give it up and died, etc. And here you see it. It's now owned by the McCauslands. I'm sorry, a very difficult time saying that. After a long struggle in which you had community organizations like WRTA or WINTRA, it's the White Marsh Valley Residential something, many, many, many people joined together to say this was a priceless heritage in their community, in the White Marsh Springfield community, township community. And it is now preserved, has a number of easements on it. It adjoins some natural lands trust area, which the Dixons gave to the Natural Lands Trust. It adjoins a number of private and public and semi-private open space. So you begin to create, even though it's not a formal Wissahickon Park, you begin to create the sense of a park along the Wissahickon. The problem, of course, in these communities is where it's not protected, the houses come right down to the stream and begin to unravel that pattern. And also the innovative institutional projects. The Morris Arboretum under Paul Meyer was particularly innovative in trying to use its land, or to recognize that its land was part of the Wissahickon, and that what it did on its land would influence what happened in the Wissahickon. And when they built their parking on the ridge, in the uplands, as they should do, they were concerned about the runoff. And so this became a porous paving parking lot, and you can see that the water goes into a recharge basin that's underneath the whole thing. This is regular asphalt, this is porous asphalt, and you can see the water running off and sinking into the asphalt and being held in the basin to be gradually released through groundwater, trickling down the hill and slowly going in a very clean fashion into the Wissahickon. And by clean, I mean not only the elegant journey, but also having been cleaned by going through the soil. And here you see that parking lot at the ridge top. And of course, the Wissahickon is down here over to your right. And the other thing that they did that was so extraordinary was to take the agricultural land that Morris had drained at the bottom of the hill, which was really a boggy area, very wet, and undrain it, break up the drainage pipes, and treat it, design it, and treat it as a marsh. And here you see it as a marsh, and of course, that not only enriched the landscape, cleaned the water of the Wissahickon, but brought a whole new constituency of bird watchers into the Morris Arboretum. And lastly, this promise of a corridor. We've talked about a corridor, and you can see the enormous amount of open space in Montgomery County. But it is, I mean, Springfield County, but it is all in the uplands, and it's all historical open space. It's all about George Washington and where his troops were encamped. Whereas as soon as you begin to cross over here, where you get Erdenheim Farms and where you get a number of those institutions and public and private open space that we talked about, you start with this nubbin of Chestnut Hill College and the Morris Arboretum, beginning this whole floodplain tributary river corridor, which creates the green core of our community and structures it. And so you see what we need to do here. We need not to concentrate so much on these areas here, but to start really looking at these smaller areas and filling in the gaps. Unfortunately, we let it go so long that many of these are heavily developed private areas, and it will be much more difficult now to reclaim those places. But we do have this miraculous spine created by so many of these private and semi-private open spaces. Lastly, just to remind us of what we've got in this corridor, this is Erdenheim Farms, this is the mansion, this is the bridge that was in the picture that I showed. This is Denton Avenue, I think. This is Chestnut Hill College, and this is Center City and the city of Philadelphia there. And you can see the Wissahickon winding through here, winding through the gorge, up through this gorge, up through, and in really to the heart of City Hall, down the boulevards and parkways that were designed into our city in the 20s. And so that's our promise, this incredible journey from the rural hinterlands, now suburbs, through the forested northwest corridor, all the way down into the center of the city to enrich the city as well. And so that's it. And thank you so much. And I hope you go out and each one of you I know has done so much for this corridor and so much for this community. And I just hope that we continue and that a new generation comes up and replaces all the very stalwart and really magnificent figures of the older generation. And so I leave it in your hands.
Thank you so much, Carol. Do you have a minute? We don't have a lot of questions in the chat box, just a couple, but if you have a couple minutes.
I do, whatever you like.
Really, I mean, many of these are more comments than questions, but Charlie asks if anyone has an interest in caretaking and maintaining the wonderful brick curbing gutters. Well, that would be extended to include cobbles as well as brick, but is there a movement to preserve them?
We certainly need one. And it's exactly the note I was trying to end on, is that we need everybody, every citizen of this community, to decide on something that pleases them and take responsibility for it. And I think it's wonderful, Charlie, that you're interested in that. And I think it would entail working with the city and working not just with the streets department, but also with the water department, and really drawing them into the solutions and creating a very fierce activist local community committee, which has gently prodded the city not to just pave them over. Many of them are still there, so we could uncover them if we wanted to and repair them. Gresham Valley Drive has wonderful ones that are almost all gone.
Something perhaps for our Historic District Advisory Committee and Preservation Committee to consider. This is a comment from the same Charlie, which is, thank you for mentioning the Gresham Valley Trail. And well, I guess this is in a public comment in the chat box. The greshamtrail.org is the website where you can go to see what the progress is on really establishing that trail. And we all hope it really comes to fruition, partnership between Philadelphia and Montgomery County.
It's so important. You saw how the Morris Arboretum and Chestnut Hill College and Erdenheim Farms and everything make that nut at the north end of Chestnut Hill, but this is the west end, and it's equally important. And it's that reaching out to the suburbs, and it's also one of the great tributaries of the Wissahickon. The Gresham Creek is a really important tributary, and I think it would add to repairing that creek as well as getting future developments to be sensitive to the creek.
What? Mike and all.
We have a question about, I think this is from Tim Greenwood, perhaps. What is the future of the Wissahickon as we see issues like Devil's Pool, i.e. overuse issues?
Well, they're very complicated issues, but I think that the most important way to approach these things is not with negativity. There's a great deal of, oh, let's keep out the Puerto Ricans because they're trashing the pool. Or let's not let kids swim in it in the hot summer when they haven't anywhere else to go. Well, we know the Wishickon's polluted, and I wouldn't swim in it myself, and I certainly wouldn't swim in Devil's Pool. But nonetheless, what it's pointing out to us over and over again are the social inequalities that we're hearing so much about today. And it's so important. The Wissahickon is a great oasis in the city. We've got to make more of them. We've got to make more opportunities for people to come out and get away from what is a solidly built up urban environment. And make them closer to their houses so they don't have to come all the way out here, much as I welcome them, and I do. And then we've got to also really begin to deal with repair and restoration, which is a long-term aspect of caring for the park. But the problem is we have too many people. When you have too many people, they're going to run down the natural world. And we've got to repair with the same vigor that we develop.
Let's see, one more comment is there anything we can do when street trees are removed from the street where we live? Do these belong to the homeowners or the community? And a corollary question to that is, how about the challenge of the forests aging out? Major replanting is required everywhere, no? And I should just mention, I'm going to put in a plug for the the Chestnut Hill tree replanting effort, which is part of Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, PHS, tree tenders program to replant street trees for free through an application process. So everybody get in touch with me if you want a free street tree next year. But there are also other efforts to replant trees in the city. And what I believe we need also is a stronger tree preservation ordinance. But the dilemma of aging and diseased trees is a big one. But any comments about what to do if, is it the homeowner or city responsibility to take down a tree?
You know, Moreland Avenue, the last block of Moreland just before it goes into the park and into the development, which is a sort of loop, got together for 2 blocks. Everybody on the street talked to each other, talked about the street trees, took down the aging sugar maples, replanted sugar maples, and they worked with the city to understand what their responsibility was versus what the city responsibility was. Unfortunately, the trees are owned by the homeowner. However, the city has jurisdiction in that they can force you to take them down. They can, they can take them down themselves if they want to. There are a lot of things that have to be worked out. It's a very complicated situation, but everything can be done if a community gets together. And Moreland Street was just a classic, wonderful example of a few neighbors who got together to replant the street. They decided on the street trees. They decided where to get them, free in some cases. They decided who was going to plant them. They worked with the city to understand the restrictions and what their responsibilities were, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a lot that can be done. And especially if neighbors get together and educate other neighbors, because there's a whole undercurrent of trees are problems. Trees drop leaves, trees get diseases, blah, blah, blah. But in our community, it has to be said, they are part of that forest structure and part of what makes it wonderful. They're also incredibly sustainable. It's cooler in the summer with trees.
Carol, was that Moreland on the west side between?
It's the west side of Moreland, between McCallum Street, which comes into McCallum Street, between McCallum Street and Cherokee, between Cherokee and Germantown Avenue. And they were, it's actually the railroad because it gets cut off at that point. But the thing was that they organized themselves. They did everything themselves as part of their block concerns. And I think that's really where it's going to come from. Yes, we do need ordinances. Yes, we need good guidance, both from the city and we need to work with the electric companies, which was actually done. A whole program was worked out with the electric companies and they've abandoned it, not to come and chop our trees about when they're going to, either put in a new cable line or whatever is functionally needed. And that was beautifully worked out by an arborist up at Cornell. And for a while was adopted by the electric company, and then generations passed and it's been forgotten. So it's really up to us as neighbors to say, this is what we want, if we want it, and then to work hard to bring these resources, many of which have been worked out before, back to the city and back to the electric company, to PICO and all those people, back to the water department, which is incredibly innovative and has done absolutely wonderful things, to remind them that these resources are available and should be put in place.
Carol, I think let's just field one more question, which is, this is kind of a big one. Just, what can property owners do to rewild their properties?
Well, one person who tried to do that was Ed Staten, and he did very well. He did, in his day, live adjacent to the Wissahickon on Chestnut Avenue. What he did was to take his lawn first and to decide what part of it he needed and what part of it was just for show or useless to him and high maintenance. And then in this case, he asked Larry Weiner to come in and put a meadow in where his lawn was. You can do that. And if you haven't got the money to do that, you can simply take it up and or let it go. You can let it go to moss by acidifying it. You just go to Killian's and buy some acid, some sulfuric acid, and gently sprinkle it on. You do have to weed it and sort of care for it until you get a nice meadow going. It's complicated, but there's lots and lots of material out there on how to do this. You can just simply let it go. It will go back to trees. This place wants to be a forest. That's why you have to mow your grass, because it wants to be forest and you see the little trees coming up in it. You could also, go somebody who has a lot of little tulip poplars, or in my case, I have hundreds of red buds coming up in my lawn. You just dig them up and plant them and then let it go. Weed carefully. And you can do a small 10 by 10 patch. You can also burn a small 10 foot by 10 foot patch with one of those backpack weed killers. Spray, it's basically a flamethrower. And then from that, just let it go. The fire generally sterilizes it. You will have some weeds because this is a weedy area and they blow in. But by judiciously weeding, you soon will have a very fine meadow. You can transplant andropogon and other native grasses by digging them up from people who have large fields of it, and bringing it and starting little islands of small trees and grass and native grasses. There's so much that you can do. It's all available out there in varying websites. It's all been explored. Some people have done it wonderfully well. It seems quite difficult and time consuming and somewhat backbreaking, but there's a lot of material out there and people have really solved many of the bad problems that pioneers had to face so many years ago.
Well, thank you. I think we could probably listen to you all night. But You need your dinner. We need ours.